a tilted playing field, the abuse of power and increasing oligarchization, the European Observer Mission criticizes Ukraine's parliamentary elections. The party of President Viktor Yanukovych has already claimed victory, but has democracy taken a step backwards in Ukraine? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Taimur Nabili. Now, Ukraine's ruling party has won the most votes in the country's parliamentary elections. But even as the Party of Regions claims the vote showed confidence in President Yanukovych, European observers have raised some serious questions about the process. From Kiev, Rory Challens has more.
The OSCE is the organisation that monitors elections for the European Union, and they say that they sent their biggest delegation ever to have a look at these elections here in Ukraine. Now, they monitored polling stations across the country, north to south, east to west, and they've just delivered their preliminary report into what they found. Their criticisms weren't so much levelled against the actual voting procedure, it was more to do with the campaigning that came before that. And they say that the ruling Party of Regions unfairly used state resources to do that campaigning, and also that it had the benefits of a media machine on its side that gave precedence to its objectives, its messages, and less to those of the opposition. Now, what the OSCE says is that this marks in some respects a step back for Ukrainian democracy. This will have ramifications for Ukraine's relationship with the European Union. Ukraine has been trying for a long time to curry the favour of the EU, and along with the jailing of opposition figurehead Yulia Timoshenko, the results that the OSCE has delivered here will negatively impact Ukraine's relationship with the EU.
Well, even heading into these elections, there were concerns about the transparency of the electoral process and the degree of control and manipulation being exercised by President Yanukovych. Most significantly, international observers were critical about the jailing of the opposition leader Yulia Timoshenko, and she herself was in no doubt that the elections would be tainted. She said this is a battle between all sensible and strong people and an absolute evil. Only the blind and the deaf can define these elections as fair and just, regardless of who will win them. Well, Timoshenko's concerns were amplified on Monday by Europe's election observers. Andreas Gross was the head of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. He said Ukrainians deserved better from these elections. The oligarchization of the whole process meant that citizens lost their ownership of the election as well as their trust in it. Unfortunately, the great democratic potential of Ukrainian society was not realized in yesterday's vote. Well, to discuss issues of Ukraine's election process, the result and the future path of the country, I'm joined by three guests. In Ukraine's capital, Kiev, Andriy Shevchenko is a member of parliament for the United Opposition. In London, Lilith Gevorgian is an analyst at IHS Global Insight, specializing in former Soviet republics and Central Asia. And also in Kiev, Maxim Eristavi, a presenter at the Voice of Capital radio station. Welcome to all three of you. Thank you for being with us on the program. Let me begin with the issue of the OSCE report that came out on Monday. They were critical of the process. They were condemnatory of the direction that it seems to be taking Ukraine. And they were suggesting that what has in fact happened during this election is a greater disenfranchisement of the Ukraine elector. Lilith, let me begin with you. None of this will come as a surprise to a number of people, but we did have other observers from other countries, from regional countries, who suggested that things were not quite so bad as the OSCE painted. Who is more credible in observing these things, and who actually has a better reflection of how operations work within countries like Ukraine?
Well, I think you're quite right when you're saying that the opinions are divided, and I think this is the case in other former Soviet states. Normally, the election observers from CIS countries would agree that the elections are relatively free and fair, whereas OSCE has much more stringent standards. And in case of Ukraine, I think even before the election campaign started, the fact that one of the biggest opposition leaders, Yulia Timoshenko, was in prison and she was not able to take part in the elections, was already a tarnishing factor. But I think what was interesting about the OSCE report was one element. I think they highlighted the so-called oligarchic influence over the first past the post list, meaning the independent candidates who have regional political or economic influence have managed to come first in the elections. And this is a very interesting factor because in some ways money and political power regionally had influenced the outcome of the elections.
Maxim, let me come to you. You are a radio presenter. I don't know whether you have a political affiliation in this particular regard, but what in general terms is the reaction of the media in Ukraine to these results?
You know, the main thing that concerns us is how the big distance between how society reacts on these elections and how politicians react, because this is pretty much important elections for this country. Ukraine is going into second recession since 2008, and we should get a very powerful or very effective government after this elections. But what we're seeing right now is like a lot of parties, a lot of winners that don't have any clear programs to solve this crisis, and it's a big concern for voters, and this is the main result why we see so low turnout and so big apathy among voters here in Ukraine.
But the OSCE was particularly critical about the way the setup to the elections was being handled. They talked of a tilted playing field. They talked about oligarchization. They suggested that the voters weren't really getting much of a choice.
Yes, this is true. We don't see any new faces in parliament, so we see a couple of political forces that get into Ukrainian parliament for the first time. This is Udar, the Klitschko boxer, famous boxer party, and the ultranationalists. But in the end, what we will see, I guess, it's a lot of same old faces in the parliament, and this is pretty frustrating because we here in Ukraine we have a very urgent need for new faces in politics. This is not me speaking as a commentator or a news anchor. This is what I'm hearing from regular voters here in Ukraine.
All right, well, Andrei, you obviously are a member of the opposition, so I suspect you will be more favorable towards the report of the OSCE in this regard. But having said that, we did see the opposition winning a reasonable number of seats. As Maxim mentioned there, Mr. Klitschko coming reasonably strongly in his performance, and the suggestion that perhaps this parliament may be a little bit more balanced against the president than the previous one. So in some cases, you could see this as progress from your perspective, couldn't you?
I'm not sure whether I got your question right, but if we are talking about the election results, I would say that it's clear for us that our country voted for changes. The ruling party regions did score the first, but it's just 1/3 of the vote, and all the rest went to the opposition parties, which is really impressive. We did not have a fair competition during this campaign, and the ruling party put our leader Yulia Timoshenko in jail and used enormous amount of money and administrative resources in order to win. Well, nevertheless, the nation did vote for change, and that's very impressive.
Well, your party leader is only one person and maybe one seat in the context of had she stood in the parliamentary election. So the fact that she couldn't run was not necessarily something that would have affected the results at all. A lot of people seem to think that Timoshenko herself is part of the reason why the opposition didn't do so well. Do you think that she may be a liability for the opposition and dividing it as much as uniting it?
We definitely see her as the leader of the united opposition, and throughout the campaign we really made sure that we followed some of her suggestions and some of her decisions. And I think for most of the Ukrainians, she is really leading all the forces which are against the regime of President Yanukovych.
Maxim, let me put the same question to you. Do you think that Yulia Timoshenko is a uniting figure for the opposition, or is her presence and her past as much a problem as a help?
Yeah. You know, I was talking to a lot of local commentators as foreign ones. So yes, you're right. This is a very interesting question, and very interesting question to answer for us, because you know, a lot of people, or a lot of powerful people in her own party, frankly, don't want to see her out of jail. So this is not a secret how she is authoritarian inside of her party, and a lot of guys inside of her party thinks that without her it would be better operatable, the opposition party. And this you know, image of jailing opposition leader, it helps them a lot to gain strength before election. But after election, it's a big question if they will pick up this theme and going forward and to ask to release Mrs. Timoshenko out of jail. I frankly don't see it's happening right now. And also, I guess this image of only jailing Timoshenko, it's very hurtful for opposition, because their voters want to know what they will do about crisis and reforms and corruption, and not only what they think or what will their strategy regarding Timoshenko.
Lilith, from your perspective, why do you think that the EU and the US are so supportive of Timoshenko? After all, as Maxim alluded to there, the time that she did have in office didn't seem to lead to any real changes, and in fact seemed to consolidate the idea of another oligarchy being formed.
Well, I think Yulia Timoshenko has greatly benefited from the fact that she was one of the most charismatic leaders of the Color Revolution, the Orange Revolution. And the US and the EU have been very supportive of the Orange Revolutionaries, hoping that they will set a model of democratic change in
But as I say,
Soviet
she had
states.
some time in power and didn't seem to set any such model in place at all. Why then does she still continue to get this rock-solid support from the West?
Indeed, I think the reason is the conviction in October 2011, because the West believes that this is selective justice, that she'd been convicted for an action that she took while in office, and it was a political decision. To their mind, to bring up criminal charges for a political decision is a form of selective justice exercised by the current government, and they're insisting that she's released from prison, and she takes part in political debate and tries to explain her decision to sign the 2009 gas contract with Russia.
Well, Andrei, let me put the question to you once again, given what we've heard from the other parties, and the suggestion that maybe Ms. Timoshenko's time in power didn't really consolidate this idea that she was a change to the model in place. Wouldn't it make more sense for the parties in opposition to choose a slightly cleaner, less tarnished leader?
I think it's not the key question which we're debating or thinking about as of the moment. Once again, I would say that as of the moment we do not know the future of the parliament, because only half of the parliament is elected with the party list, and the other half of the parliament is elected in the single-member districts. And the results there are being counted at this very moment that you're talking to me. So as of the moment, it's not clear what's going to be the future of this new parliament, but we know for sure that it's going to be much more difficult for President Yanukovych to control this parliament. For us, the future presidential election is something we are going to discuss way later. As of the moment, it's really important to stay united as one team, and I think we have been doing quite well on that during this parliamentary campaign.
What about this apparent contradiction between the suggestion that Mr. Yanukovych is somehow leading the country away from democracy, and yet results of elections suggest that he is actually being lessened in his power?
Well, I think if you look from an opposition perspective, they believe that they should have won this election. So anything short of that is obviously for them is this disappointment. But I do agree that with your previous point that unfortunately for the opposition, they didn't manage to consolidate their ranks. At the moment, we're looking at united opposition sort of joining into unholy union with ultra-nationalists, not an ideal combination. But as I said in the beginning, I think the first past the post system where you see the independent candidates using their political and economic power to get to parliament is the place to work, because many of them do not have ideological background or leanings, but they are rather sort of aligning with political power, regardless its color. So if it's the ruling party of regions that wins the elections, then they will most likely support them. If it's the opposition, they are most likely to support the opposition. And it's this swinging sort of deputies that are quite worrisome, and that is where the problem lies, to my mind.
Maxim, in the West, a lot of the Ukrainian political issue is framed in a fairly straightforward manner. They see one party as being pro-West, one party as being pro-Russia, and the electorate voting along those lines. Is that an accurate portrayal of how the electorate and the political system in Ukraine thinks?
You know, you're completely right about that. There is, I guess, some issue with that Ukrainian idea among foreign media or foreign perspective that Ukraine is between West and East. But you know, during the last, I guess, year, this idea we see like it's completely collapsed, and we are seeing very difficult relations with the EU, very strangled and very difficult relations with Russia, and you know, we are seeing the issue of international isolation of Ukraine. So it's not a question now will we be in EU or in union with Russia. It is a question how this election will change the situation with international isolation. And from what we're seeing right now, from reaction from international observers, European one, and from Russia, they are very pretty positive about outcome of this election, about in a matter of transparency and how it was done clean, and they are very optimistic about new parliament. So they see this maybe some forces with which they can work now, I guess. So it's very optimistic perspective from outside, and I guess we are seeing inside of Ukraine also much more optimism about international relations Ukraine with other world.
While we're talking about the EU, let me just remind our viewers of one of the elements involved in this conversation, because this critical report from the OSCE may well have a significant impact on Ukraine's relationship with Europe, because as well as demanding the release of Yulia Timoshenko in particular, the EU has set other conditions for normalizing its relations with Ukraine. Those conditions include an end to the selective prosecution of all political opponents, free and fair elections according to what they call international standards, and the reform of the judiciary and the constitution. Andrei, let me ask you about relations with the EU, and do you think the EU will regard this election as fair enough now to improve its relations with Ukraine?
If we are talking about the relations between the European Union and Ukraine, well, look, I think the Europeans expected out of this election exactly the same things that the Ukrainians did. We expected more free press, we expected less corruption, and we expected that these political repressions or political motivated justice would stop. And nothing of that really happened. So I think most of the Ukrainians, they do share what the OSCE observation mission stated this morning. And I don't really see how this election can really improve the relationship between President Yanukovych's administration and the European Union. And I really think that this election was about choosing between two different models of the future of Ukraine. I think there are major differences between the ruling administration and this wide coalition of opposition forces. And it's not just about the geopolitical choice, it's not just about Russia versus the European Union, but it's about a wide range of issues.
Maxim, let me ask you about the Russia question. Is there a perception, do you think, in Ukraine that Russia has been playing behind the scenes here, has been unduly influencing events?
You know, I agree with Andrei about that geopolitical issue is not on the table during these elections in Ukraine. But, you know, it's also not about authoritarianism or democracy or any other issue. It's economy as the main player at ballot boxes here in Ukraine. So the voters want to see a new government, you know, to fix the big economical problems we are facing right now, and Russia or United States or EU is always the theme to discuss, I don't know, at kitchen table, but it's not what really matters or concerns the Ukrainian voters. I'm pretty sure about that.
Okay, well, Lilith, let me put it to you from an outside perspective then, because it may not be concerning to the Ukrainian voters on the ground, but it's certainly a subject of some discussion outside of Ukraine amongst the major powers. And President Putin's position seems to have shifted backwards and forwards depending on the leadership at various times, but certainly he has an interest in Ukraine, doesn't he?
Of course, Russian President Vladimir Putin would like Ukraine to join the Moscow-led customs union, which also includes Belarus and Kazakhstan. In fact, and they made it even more attractive for Ukraine, saying that if they join them, then they will pay only $160 per 1,000 cubic meter of gas, a very painful issue for Ukrainians. But still, President Yanukovych has been resisting, both for foreign and domestic political reasons. And in some ways, it answers your question whether he was a pro-Kremlin or pro-Russian president. If he truly were to do a Kremlin project as initially he was presented, he would have long joined the customs union. Obviously, Ukraine is a very interesting case because internally it is divided between the West, that is the Western Ukraine, which is traditionally more pro-Western, and Eastern Ukraine traditionally more pro-Russian. And any Ukrainian politician has to take this into account. Okay. I think, to Yanukovych's credit, I think he came up with the best plan to build a bridge, to turn Ukraine into a bridge between Russia and EU. But thus far, he's done exactly the opposite, managed to create tensions both with Russia and with EU.
All right. Well, on that point, we'll have to end the conversation. Thank you very much to my guests in Kiev, Andrei Shevchenko and Maxim Eristavi, and in London, Lilith Gevorgian. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Do send us your feedback. You can email your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.net. For the moment, it's goodbye. See you next time.